Welcome to Good History, the podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma State University History Department and inspired by the esteemed historian and Oklahoma native Dr. John Hope Franklin's line that a good historian is a moralist at heart. We bring together people from diverse walks of life who research history, studied history, read history, and think about history. We want to know what history means to them, and we want to ask them a big question. If studying history doesn't necessarily make us feel good, how does knowing more of it make our lives better?
Welcome, everyone, to Good History. My name is Kallie Kosc. I am an assistant professor of history here at OSU with a research and teaching focus on 19th century Native North America. I will be guest hosting this season's episode of Good History around the theme of storytelling. When we first hear the word story, we might think of something simple, a short fictional narrative, perhaps. But philosophers, cultures, and historians have long recognized storytelling as a powerful tool that can bind people together or divide them. Stories help us understand who we are and make sense of the world around us. So what makes stories and the act of storytelling so powerful? Joining us today is Professor Matthew Spellberg. Spellberg is the Dean of the Faculty and the Chair of Literature at Outer Coast, a two-year liberal arts school in Sitka, Alaska. He co-teaches courses in Indigenous Studies, Literature, and Tlingit language. His research focuses on Tlingit oral literature and the European novel, language and culture revitalization, and on the history of dreams and the imagination. Welcome to Good History, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Kallie. I'm glad to be here.
So I really want to get into how you ended up at Outer Coast. But to start off, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you got interested in stories and literature and language in the first place.
Hmm. I grew up in a bilingual household, and that's probably the single most formative fact about me and about my childhood. I grew up in the United States in California, but in a household where we spoke Polish as well as English. And my mom's family is Polish, and I grew up especially around my grandma and some of my great aunts and a Polish nanny named Adela who lived with us for many years. And those ladies really imparted to me a sense of the preciousness and value of language. And I think particularly I had this feeling growing up that like we spoke a special language at home. And Polish is later in my life I started working on endangered indigenous languages. Polish is of course not an endangered language. There are millions and millions and millions of speakers of Polish. But in suburban California, the only speakers of Polish around were the ones inside my family unit. And so it felt like this precious, fragile, delicate thing. And I could tell how much it shaped me and distinguished me and made me conscious of who I was in the world. My family sometimes tells this story about how I thought that the proper names of everything growing up were the Polish names for things. So like I had a stuffed animal that was like this little stuffed lamb, and I thought it was a lamb, but its name was Baranek, which means little lamb in Polish. But I sort of understood like everything in its particularity to be Polish and everything in its general case to be English when I was a kid. And so that experience, I think, was really growing up in that way just was so important for me. It made me love language. It made me feel also really, really connected in a special way to the past. Like I grew up in a kind of multi-generational household situation, and I heard a lot of stories, both like folk tales and folk songs, and then also stories about World War II and the 1930s, which had marked the older generation in my family very deeply, as with many Polish people. And so I think I had this sense I had just an acute sense of something that's true for everyone, but I think was just marked for me in a distinctive way as a child, which is that language is a genuine transmitter of the past into the present and a kind of portal that opens up in such a way that you can really be in the past and you can sort of be living in these story worlds. And I guess I'd add one more thing in terms of the stories that I grew up with. So my dad's side of the family is not Polish. My dad is an American. His family comes from Russian Jewish stock, but they came over much earlier. But my dad loved like Greek myths and Norse mythology, things like that. And he used to tell me stories from, like the Greek myths, from the Trojan War, Homer, things like that in the bathtub when I was a kid. And I just loved that. I mean, I felt such a kind of immediate connection to that. So I think out of that sense of a kind of like mythical or folkloric substratum, like that's where my love for language and story comes from.
That's so fascinating. And it just really makes me think about maybe how much more obvious cultural knowledge and the uniqueness of different cultures is when you live or you grow up in a multicultural household or in a multicultural community, as opposed to growing up in one that is more culturally homogenous and you just sort of maybe take everything as standard and take it for granted. But it sounds like you were sort of acutely aware that there are these different ways of knowing and experiencing the world in the past,
Yeah.
potentially.
And I think it's important to underline that that kind of local cultural heterogeneity was the rule for most of human history. Like that is actually the natural way in which humans, if you can use that word natural, the way that humans ex experience culture. Like in Eastern Europe, for instance, before World War II, people grew up in cities and towns that were almost all multilingual, right? Like Ukrainian and Yiddish and Polish and Romanian were spoken in very close proximity to each other. And people, you read books from the 20s or 30s, memoirs of people's childhoods then, and they describe like thinking, well, I spoke four different languages, but I didn't even think of them as languages. It was just that in the market I talked this way, and to my
Mm.
parents I talked this way, and to my grandparents I talked this way, and to my neighbors I talked this way, and that's just how I talked to people. But they were switching between languages, and if you think about Native North America or many other huge cultural regions in the world before basically the advent of the nation state and its pressure to standardize language over huge swaths of population, people grew up in villages in very close proximity to villages that had different dialects or totally different languages. People married across those villages, people traded across those villages. So people had a strong sense of growing up in a world where they had their own deep cultural identity, but they were acutely aware of the presence of other cultures in their periphery, and they developed a sense of what it meant to belong to a community in relation to that.
Yeah, and you see that so much in colonial America and early America, which is kind of the area that I look at most. And I do find it so interesting, and I think a lot of people find it surprising when they actually go in and start to understand what life was like in these periods and in these places. Like just like you said, there were so many different cultures interacting with each other on a daily basis. And I think people don't quite understand, like you say, that that was the norm. It was normal to see people from all different walks of life speaking all sorts of different languages and just navigating that. Um,
Yeah, and people telling all kinds of different stories about the nature of the world, and people finding a way to live with the contradictions or inconsistencies in those stories as they were presented adjacent to one another. So, like on the subject of colonial America, there's a little essay by Benjamin Franklin that I love, where he's writing about indigenous people in North America and his interactions with him, and he reports this story about a Protestant minister, a Swedish minister who goes to preach among the Susquehannock. And he tells them the story of, in Benjamin Franklin's retelling, he tells them the story of Adam and Eve and the garden and the fall. And they're all nodding along and they say it's a really great story. And they thank him so much for bringing this story from his mother's. And he's so pleased because he thinks he's about to make a bunch of converts. And then they say, since you have come all this way to tell us your mother's story, we're going to tell you ours. And they proceed to tell him the story of how the three sisters, the crops came about, and this woman comes down from the sky, and they bring her meat, and she sits down, and where she sits down, the tobacco and the beans and everything grow, and corn, and the the preacher, so Franklin reports, is just apoplectic. He's like, I have told you the gospel truth, and you have replied with falsehood and lies and paganism and so forth.
Right.
And uh, and he reports that someone stands up in the council house and says, "Your mothers have not raised you right because we, whose mothers have raised us right, believed your story. It's only right that you should believe ours." And that seems to me like just a lost, kind of magnificent thing about the epistemology of the true epistemology of storytelling and storytelling cultures is people understanding that you can believe one story and be okay with there being another story just in the nearby proximity and not feel like the one has to be in a death struggle with the other.
I love that. Yeah, that's such a great story. I'd love to talk a little bit about how you got into researching dreams and the imagination. It it is sort of a, I don't know, is it a subset of storytelling? How did you get into that? And what did you learn about what are dreams? Because from what I understand, you've kind of approached this from a very multidisciplinary perspective. And I wonder if you could
Mm.
just take us through that trajectory of, how you started out with this fascination with literature and stories and language and how that translated into researching dreams and the imagination.
Yeah. I have always been really interested in the kind of mythical or visionary register of human experience. That's just been something that has drawn me since I was a little kid. And like I said, I grew up in an environment where there were myths around and folk tales around and that sense of the world being kind of alive and the forest being kind of alive. That was something in the air, and that was a great gift that my family gave me as a kid. And so that, like I said, that particular level of human expression has always drawn me. And of course, that level of human expression is really connected to dreams. Dreams are often sort of seen as the conduits by which people connect to that sacred or divine or mythical world. But my interest in dreaming as a discrete phenomenon really comes from when I was in college. I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, and I studied there with the literary critic and philosopher Elaine Scarry, and she had a really, really deep influence on my thinking, on my life, on my career. I was her research assistant for a number of years, and she has this just extraordinary attention to the way that the body and the imagination are intertwined. I think that's maybe the simplest way to lay out the very, very complex thought system that she has developed over the course of her life. But many people see the body and the imagination as kind of opposites of each other, and she really sees them as arrayed along a spectrum, really deeply connected to each other, which is to say that like the imagination is a part of the concrete sensuous or connected to and draws upon the concrete sensuous facts of existence, of bodily existence. And so, you know, I was, when I got to college, I was really interested in like big abstract ideas and so taken with philosophers and their very complex recondite theories of reality. And she really taught me that like the hardest thing, the most satisfying thing, the most interesting thing to try to wrap your mind around is like the concrete sensuous facts of the world. Like she would ask students in her classes to like really, really, really look at a chestnut leaf and like spend time thinking about the symmetry and the radial patterns in this chestnut leaf and try as hard as possible to use your mental apparatus, to use your language, your everything going on in your brain to try to describe what is this thing that I'm seeing, and to see that kind of close attention to the world as the real portal towards accessing in a deep way the imagination. Anyway, while I was working for her, I was helping her do some research. I was running errands for her as she was writing a book about imagining color. And through that process, I came across a 19th century French dream sort of explorer. His name was Léon Hervé de Saint-Denis. And he had written this book about his kind of adventures in dreaming. He was a lucid dreamer. It wasn't called that back then, but he could control his dreams. And he was interested in basically exploring his dream life and then writing these lavish, highly detailed descriptions about his dreams. And it just blew my mind. It just blew my mind to read this book and to see, and I think working with Elaine Scarry had sort of prepared me to see the importance of like thinking about mental phenomena in this highly concrete, highly sensuous way. But suddenly I saw this guy living this extraordinary, immense, kind of mythical life in his own dreams. And I remember after reading that book, I said to myself, I'm going to try to write down my dreams. And I bought a little notebook and I put it by my bed. And that night I had a really extraordinary dream, which I wrote down in that notebook. And, I started writing down my dreams every night after that. And I just became so interested in dreaming, or it seemed like dreams fit so closely into or helped open up sort of a lot of the questions that I was interested in already, or crystallize them. And I became really interested at first in the writers who were interested in dreams. So, like, I wrote a senior thesis about Marcel Proust, who remains a writer that I just love. And um, I spent a lot of time reading folks like Thomas de Quincey, other figures in the European tradition who love dreams and are really interested in dreams, Coleridge, and so forth. And then gradually my interests started to widen. Like I became interested in the science of dreaming, the neuroscience of dreaming. Actually spent a year in France studying the neuroscience of dreaming. And then um, I went back to the US to do a PhD in literature, and I was kind of interested in all of these, philosophical and phenomenological accounts of what dreaming was and how it relates to visionary experience and everything. But it always felt a little bit like I was banging my head against a door. Like it just felt like, I mean, both in a frustrating way and a pleasurable way. Like dreaming is so hard to wrap your mind around. It's really something. I mean, such a fundamental human experience, but really something that is very, very, very hard to figure out. And there's not a good account in the mainstream intellectual discourse of what dreaming even is. Uh, and then I started reading, like, first through kind of anthropological literature, indigenous accounts of dreaming from small scale communities in the Americas, in East Asia, in South Asia, and that was like suddenly the horizon expanded immensely
Mhm.
because suddenly I encountered societies that rather than sort of considering dreams to be sort of weird or sort of marginal or something kind of extremely private, I encountered societies that actually had put dreaming at the center of their intellectual and spiritual, and even in some cases political life for millennia. And so there was just like unbelievably sophisticated thinking about dreams going on in these non-Western cultures and often in these, like I say, small scale societies. And that was like a huge revelation. And so I felt like I kind of had to start my education all over again. And basically, I've been in that spot for about 10 years now of trying to get educated in the thousands and thousands of years of very, very serious thinking about dreams that got pushed to the margins over the course of the kind of evolution of modernity. And that's also become a big focus of my research is why is it that some societies, and in particular, like Western culture in its so-called modern phase, really push dreams to the margins, whereas other cultures really see dreams as being the very, very center of experience. And just to frame that one other way, right? There are like in a lot of Western philosophy, like dreams are taken as the sort of limit case for skepticism, for epistemological skepticism, right? So people say like one of the reasons why it's hard to figure out whether reality is real is because when you're dreaming, you don't know if it's real, but it's just a dream. In some cultures, dreams are taken to be the most real form of reality, and everything else is a kind of echo or shadow of the dream. So I became really interested in why do dreams polarize cultures in that kind of way?
I would love to explore that question a little bit more because you started to get at exactly what I was wondering while you were sort of explaining your trajectory here and how you've looked at dreams historically and philosophically. So it sounds like in kind of the Western tradition, increasingly, like you say, dreams have been given a lot of skepticism and kind of pushed away, something to maybe not take so seriously. Whereas in a lot of non-Western societies, like you say, that is the most real thing. What have you come to understand as some of the maybe reasons for that? Why in Western cultures dreams are considered so something that should be given a lot of skepticism, and in non-Western cultures, something that is so highly revered. What do you think accounts for that? I'm sure there's many potential answers, but it's a fascinating.
Yeah, I have a very heterodox one,
Oh,
which
I'm
I'll
ready
just,
for it.
yeah, I'll just throw out here. This is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that it has to do with certain contradictions at the heart of the Christian account of dreaming. Like a lot of people would say that this kind of phenomenon has to do with the scientific revolution and the kind of evolution of modernity. I actually think it was set in motion a lot earlier in Western culture. And like basically what I see is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, in the Bible, dreams are seen as very important, as they are in many traditional religious cultures. But early on, the Bible develops a narrative by which the legitimacy of dreams is really validated by their opposition to secular power. So
Hmm.
prophets and dreamers in the Bible, like they are set against the leaders of the community. They're the ones prophesying against the sins and debasement of the kings and so forth. And if you look at the role that dreams played in that moment when Christianity started to evolve, dreams play a hugely important role in late antiquity, in the early Christian period. And people are having very direct revelations and direct sort of visionary encounters with Jesus and other figures. You see this a little bit in the New Testament, but then you really see it in the early hagiographies, in the martyrologies. When Christianity became the imperial religion, when it ceased to be a persecuted religion, dreams were sort of stuck at a bit of an impasse because they in this discourse, in this ideological framework, they drew their legitimacy from their opposition to temporal power. And when Christianity became the temporal power, as well as the spiritual power, then suddenly dreams seemed very dangerous. There didn't seem to be a good way to bring dreams into the fold. And you see over the course of the Middle Ages a kind of real restriction. Jacques Le Goff has written really beautifully about this, actually. You see this extraordinary kind of restriction of the realms in which dreaming and talking about dreams and sort of having ownership over your dreams is a kind of restriction of the areas and spaces in which that's permitted. Basically, like in monasteries, in convents, where it just feels like everyone is ideologically correct. Talking about dreams and having spiritual dreams is very licit. But a peasant goes around saying they dreamed of the Virgin Mary, and the Inquisition is there in a hot second to tell them, no, you didn't. It's a demon who came to you and it looked like the Virgin Mary. So there comes to be this need to sort of control or restrict dreaming, and I think it has to do with this sense that like dreaming really gets its part of the sort of charge of dreaming and the intervention of the spiritual in people's individual lives, is this kind of opposition to the status quo. You see that then play out in the later history of Christianity, in which dreamers really do become almost always schismatics, right? Like, I mean, Joseph Smith or Thomas Müntzer, or so many figures. Like, and I think something that's really interesting, something I spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about and reading about, and up here working with elders on, is like you see in a lot of indigenous cultures, you see like there is this kind of prophetic revelatory uh, role for dreams, but there is then a method by which that prophetic revelatory experience of a dreamer gets reintegrated into a community. So there's a protocol by which a community can take this thing and can bring it into its overarching narratives and find a balance between having the dream modify the narrative and having the narrative sort of modify or fit the dream back into it. So there's a kind of negotiation between the pre-existing cosmological or philosophical system and what the dreamer is bringing in. And what you see in Western culture, I would argue, is like an inability to do that. Essentially, when a visionary dream appears, there's no way to sort of fold it neatly in, and so it causes conflict. It causes an immediate rupture, and that's why it's been marginalized. And you even see like when the dream gets really picked up by the avant-garde in modernity, like in the 19th and 20th centuries, when dreaming becomes actually very important in a certain way in Western culture, but it becomes important because of Freud, because of the surrealists, because of modernism. Like these people all see themselves as the enemies of mainstream society, right? They see themselves as the opponents of the bourgeoisie, of the Philistines, of industrialization, of all the mainstream things. And so again, like the dream gets its energy and its meaning as a tool of resistance in Western culture rather than as a tool for a society's harmonious evolution or development.
That is so fascinating. And I think it's an interesting point that I think connects to an earlier point that you made about these the exchanging of origin narratives in sort of in the colonial period. You mentioned the Susquehannock and then this Protestant missionary who's talking to them and telling them, no, 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 you're wrong. And them saying essentially, um, no, like we can accept each other's tellings of these things. And what you were
Exactly.
just that reminded me of what you were just mentioning about how in certain indigenous cultures, a dream can be integrated into the broader whole in the worldview. And it seems to me like there is a flexibility there that you don't see so much in a lot of Western culture. Like you said, the dream is sort of considered a threat almost to the existing order. There's not a lot of openness and flexibility. It's much more rigid. And I think that's really interesting because I think, like you say, we might think about dreaming being discarded by Western societies with the growth of science and scientific realism and wanting to sort of push that away as something that isn't as grounded in a testable, replicable reality. But I think that's really fascinating that there is perhaps this deeper thread of the skepticism of dreams that kind of goes back to, it sounds like power and
Yeah.
authority in a way. And I think about it, even though the Protestant Reformation and the first and second great awakenings weren't so much necessarily about dreams per se, but about the personal experience and that personal experience sort of challenging the existing authority of the church, of the state, whatever it was. So yeah, I just find that really, really interesting.
And in some cases they really were about dreams. I mean, they really truly were very directly about dreams. Like for instance, the Shaker movement is just deeply,
Yes.
deeply about dreaming. I mean, both the visions of Mother Anne, and then you may know about this kind of extraordinary moment, the era of manifestations, it's called in Shaker history, like just around the time that the last people who had known Mother Anne died. This is like the 1830s and 40s. And so that direct living link to the founder was gone. There was this kind of sudden explosion of dream visions in the Shaker communities, and people had these elaborate dreams in which often it was phrased as Mother Anne came to them in a dream and showed them these kinds of maps of the cosmos. And then people would draw pictures of these dreams, exquisite little pictures, and they would give them to other Shakers. And it was as if in this moment of doctrinal uncertainty, right, where the living link had fallen away, people's response, the sort of deep response, was to access the dream world and to try to sort of hash out these cosmological questions through dreams. And people started communicating and sharing their dreams through these beautiful little drawings. And you see like this kind of direct relationship between these questions of like authority, knowledge, and then the dream. And like right around that time, the era of manifestations kind of closes when the Shakers come together to actually codify in writing the sort of tenets of the doctrine, right? Because before there had been this kind of oral understanding and set of practices. And so, like, also literacy plays a big role in and writing plays a big role in how these forces ebb and flow in human history. Like I think dreams are often allied with the oral and with the sort of lived practice rather than with writing. Like I think writing tends to then devalue that multiplicity and individuality of people's dreams.
Well, that makes me wonder now how you ended up getting interested in indigenous storytelling cosmologies. At what point
Yeah.
were you introduced to that, and did you start kind of running with it and really becoming a student of that?
Yeah. So again, you might say like lots of things in my life primed me for it. Like I was saying, I grew up in a bilingual household, really attuned to the preciousness of language, really interested in old stories. I grew up around a lot of elders. I grew up around a lot of older women who had lived lives kind of beyond my imagination, and that was just so important to me as a kid. So a lot of things kind of that are really treasured in indigenous communities. Like in some ways, maybe you would say my childhood primed me to be attuned to them and interested in them. But that said, I knew nothing about indigenous culture for most of my life. So I grew up in the Bay Area. Um, like I said, I grew up with this strong connection to Polish culture. I was a very Europhile kid. I was reading novels as a young kid and just dreaming of Tolstoy and I loved reading history books and it's always about the Age of Kings and Crusades and stuff like that. That was very much where my imagination was. But my dad, who also grew up in the Bay Area, also grew up in California, was a huge backpacker, and he always took us out to the Sierras. We backpacked all through the Sierras as a kid, and so I also grew up just blessed with being in the West, in nature, and loving that so much. But in the way I grew up, it just felt like those two things were totally separate. It's like culture is in Europe and nature is here in California
Mm.
in the West, and like they don't meet. And then when I was in graduate school, I read a book. It truly just like was incredible serendipity. I was like in the library running my hands over the spines in the stacks. And you know how in university libraries all the books have identical bindings? There was one book that didn't have that identical brown binding. It had its own original binding, and it just jumped out at me. And I pulled it off the shelf, and it was a book called A Story as Sharp as a Knife: The Classical Haida Myth Tellers and Their World by a man named Robert Bringhurst. And it's about the oral storytelling traditions and the whole cultural world surrounding them of the Haida people in British Columbia. And that book just blew my mind. That book just stood up and told me, you must change your life. It's like the poem by Rilke, where the statue says that to the speaker of the poem at the very end. Like, I just felt like I realized I knew nothing about this huge world, and I realized that I had been so wrong in thinking that nature and culture were separated by this huge ocean,
Mm.
that nature and culture were so intimately, inextricably connected on this continent where I had spent most of my life, and I was in total ignorance of it. And of course, like it took even longer for me to realize, oh, right, the ignorance is on purpose. Like that's kind of what colonialism does to people. It makes people think that humans have no deep obligations to the land around them and so forth. So it just that started. I was about 24 when I read that book, and that just started a kind of huge process where I had to begin my whole education again. And I sought out the author of that book, who had spent a long time working on Haida, and he became an early mentor of mine. And I think one of the things that was most powerful about that book was that that book somehow conveyed to me that if I were to do this work and to do it correctly and honestly, I couldn't just do it from books. that like I couldn't just do the thing that I had been trained to do as a scholar, which is now that I've read one book, I'm going to go read the seven other books or the 50 other books in the bibliography, like that I actually had to go be on the land and above all get to know the people. And so I started traveling in graduate school in the summers a little bit on the DL. I was kind of hiding this from my advisors because I was ostensibly working on European literature and European novel, which is stuff that I still love and loved then and still teach and everything. But I started traveling to the Pacific Northwest, and I spent some time on Haida Gwaii, on the islands of the Haida people in northern British Columbia. And then, for various reasons, I started traveling farther north, and I was in Tlingit territory, which is just to the north of Haida territory. And I got to know people, I got to know the communities, I read all the books I possibly could, especially anywhere where there was direct transcription of stories from the language and translation. And I realized to really get to the heart of it, you have to work on the language, or it's one way anyway, maybe the way that for me made the most sense. Some people go deep, deep, deep in the art, and that's an extraordinary thing. I don't have those kinds of gifts with my hands, but anyway, so I started working on the language. I went to Juneau, Alaska, to learn Tlingit. I didn't know anyone, and I was kind of walking around town. I went to the Orthodox Church because I knew there was a long-standing connection with the Tlingit people there, and um, I asked at the Orthodox Church if the priest knew of anyone who was working on Tlingit language, and he said, "Yeah, there's a group that meets at the public library on Mondays." And so the following Monday, I went to the public library and I met this Tlingit woman named Linda Belardi. Satuk was her Tlingit name, and she and I became very close. And a number of years later, she adopted me into her clan, and we became family. Very sadly, she passed away last year, but through her and through many other people, I just met this extraordinary group of language learners and language teachers and elders and speakers and people just working so hard to keep the language alive. It's a very endangered language, Tlingit, but there's a lot of energy around revitalization. And it was just incredible to me to see the just spiritual and intellectual seriousness around which people bring to the study of these languages. And I think I I had been in a milieu for many years in big research universities where people were always talking about the importance of language and literature, but I never really saw people truly live and express the importance of it until I went to an indigenous community where people did not take their language and their tradition for granted. Like people saw like what it looks like when a language or a tradition is under attack and what is needed to keep it going, to keep it alive. And I always tell people I meet often with an amazing group of Tlingit language learners and teachers from villages all over Alaska, and we meet on Zoom. And I always tell people if I were to paint the like perfect picture of intellectual life, like my version of Raphael's School of Athens, it would be the Zoom screen when I'm meeting with Tlingit language learners. Like
Yeah.
it's just such an incredible set of just such an incredible ideal way of investing yourself in language and culture.
And it all started with a book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a dangerous thing to do reading books.
I know, I know.
Yeah,
So how is it that you came to be affiliated with Outer Coast? Did that sort of come out of this growing connection with the Tlingit community there in Alaska? Um,
totally.
take us through what that was like, because Outer
Yeah.
Coast hasn't been around for very long, even though its
No.
sort of foundations and where it sits has some very deep history.
Yeah. So when I first started coming up to Southeast Alaska, a colleague of mine, I was a postdoc at Harvard at the time, and a colleague of mine at Harvard said, "Hey, there's this new college starting up, this new school starting up, new institution, uh, not even yet a college, and it's on Tlingit territory, and like you should connect with them." And so I did, and it didn't quite work out for me to visit them that summer when I was in Juneau the first time, but I sort of kept following what they were doing, and then I applied to teach for a semester at Outer Coast right around the tail end of the pandemic, and I came up in January of 2022, and I was just supposed to stay here for a semester. And about 3 weeks in, I just realized there was so much potential here. I mean, it was still an institution just so completely in its infancy. And I mean, even now we're still kind of just in our toddlerhood or maybe adolescence, but then it was really just a baby institution. But there was so much energy, there was so much excitement. The tiny staff that was working there were just so full of enthusiasm. And I could see that there was the real potential to kind of flip what happens so often, right? Which is that people who are interested in working in small communities as academics, like they sort of parachute in when they're not teaching at their big university, and then then they fly back out. And here it was a chance to sort of flip the situation and actually be teaching in the community. And that just felt so amazing and exciting, and like there was so much potential. And so I called the executive director on the phone and I said, I'd like to stay and I'd like to be the dean and I would like to build this institution. And to his great credit, he said, okay. And and so that was that. I was the first full-time academic hire, and I knew that I wanted to recruit these two colleagues of mine who I'd had at Harvard, who just do brilliant work in Indigenous studies. And I convinced them to move their family up here to Sitka. I've also been incredibly blessed to work very closely with Yedi Cook Dion Brady Howard, who's one of the just great tradition bearers here in culture bearers here in Sitka. She's also just an important leader in this community. She's the chair of the Sitka Tribe of Alaska, and she's our chair of Indigenous Studies at Outer Coast. And like we're a small faculty. We kind of work as a family. We really try to sort of model a kind of relationship to education that's based on kinship. And yeah, it's been a thrilling experience, and it gives us a chance. We're here at the very kind of, we're far away from the sort of centers of academic authority, and we're also very small and very nimble. And so in this moment when higher ed is just seized with crisis after crisis and people are constantly wringing their hands, like it has just felt like we're kind of free to trace a different path. And that's been just extraordinary. That's been just so fun and so rewarding.
I've been so excited and interested learning more about Outer Coast's curriculum. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what it is and where it came from and what sets Outer Coast apart. You mentioned that it's sort of outside of the traditional academic institutions and it can be more nimble. What does that actually look like for the students who are there?
Yeah, sure. So I think like all organic places, Outer Coast is a kind of palimpsest. It's a kind of coming together of many different educational traditions. The first idea behind Outer Coast, so when it was when it was a first kind of dream, it was the project of a man named Jonathan Christ Tompkins, who was for many years our state legislator here in Sitka, someone who grew up in Sitka, who's a really amazing Alaskan politician and community leader here. He had gone to Yale and he had met people who had attended the school Deep Springs in the California desert. And Deep Springs is a tiny college that where students do the first 2 years of their undergraduate education in small community. There's like 25 students or 30 students, and it's a working farm in the desert. It's 100 years old. It was founded by a man named L.L. Nunn, and they have a really distinctive educational model where there's three, they call them pillars, where the students get an academic education, but then also they have to do labor. That's the second pillar. They have to run this farm. And then the third pillar, they practice what is called in this Nunnian vocabulary, in L.L. Nunn's vocabulary, self-governance. So they're responsible for running the school. And so the idea at first was to create a kind of Deep Springs here in Sitka, Alaska, that Jonathan thought this would be a great place for a model like that. And so bringing in the idea of these three pillars of these different sort of this holistic and self-sustaining community model of education. And some aspects of that have still really stayed part of the curriculum. For me, I think one of the things that was really one of the models that was really important was Black Mountain College. So I had been a long time interested in this experimental college that arose in um, North Carolina in the 19 I think it was actually started in the 30s, but its sort of heyday was in the 40s and 50s. This small college really focused on artistic practice and this kind of living in community, and it produced just an extraordinary, it was a small school. It never actually graduated a student. There was no sort of real set curriculum, but they trained basically a whole generation of just the most important artists in the American post-war period. Like, it's just incredible, the people who came out of that school, and particularly the school, the sort of pedagogy of the school was really built on the work of this man, Joseph Albers, this refugee from Nazi Germany, this brilliant art teacher who really developed a kind of method for teaching people the discipline of art in a way that could open them up to new possibilities. And so I was thinking about what would it look like to create a school like that, to create a pedagogy like that, but really oriented towards the things that are special about this community, Sitka. And so for me, that's the just incredible opportunity to bring together indigenous ways of knowing and European or Western ways of knowing. And to think about like what would it be like to build an educational institution that could make good on the just incredible potential of intellectual exchange that these two incredible cultural systems, when coming together, could have instead of what happened in history, which was kind of catastrophe and bloodshed. Um, so, so the idea was like, what would it look like to build a school that's really responsive to that, to the bringing together of these two traditions in a town, in a community where those two traditions meet in very complex and interesting and syncretic ways already. And so, what would it be like to learn from that, to be a respectful student of that, to have students come and be guests in that system and try to understand it. And I guess I would say that the final thing that really feeds in here is that like that meant creating a school that's really modeled on principles of interdependence. And so like people talk a lot about education as being about, independence and agency and people finding themselves, and all of that is important in the right measure. But I think for us, what is unique about Outer Coast, what is special about Outer Coast is that you come to this very small college in a small town that's fly-in only. We can only be reached by a boat or by a plane. And like this is a community where people really, really have to rely on each other. And also the indigenous cultural context here is very much built on a structure of reciprocity and gifting. So you see interdependence in practice as a way of living all the time around you here. And you see it also just in the way that the ecological system is still so intact and the way animal life and plant life interacts with each other. And so like we ask students to come here and really put that idea of interdependence first and foremost in their educations. And we say like when you are here in Sitka, when you're at Outer Coast, like everything that you're learning in the classroom is about like understanding how you fit into these wider webs of obligation and reciprocity and what you can do wherever you go in your life to maintain webs like that, to repair webs like that, to build webs like that.
I love that. And I think it's just such an important skill and juxtaposition to, like you say, what we tend to be taught, which is ingraining this sense of independence and not relying too much on other people. But you miss a lot of the richness of community that way. And this also just sort of makes me think about mental health today and issues of loneliness that people feel. And, the research is there even that people are happier when they have a close connection to other people, when they have community. And yet, it's still not something that's really being cultivated in, I think, our mainstream institutions. And it's also reminding me of about the difference between fluidity, openness, and kind of rigidity, and the obsession with kind of categorization. You know, you mentioned kind of the mind-body dichotomy that we get a lot in kind of the Western way of the human body versus the human mind. I mean, I think it's evolved a lot since then in neuroscience. Humans and the environment, that's something that historically people's conception of has changed over time and between cultures. And there's been increasingly within Western society and Western culture this emphasis on becoming independent from nature or controlling nature, separating out humans from the natural world. Like you said, reciprocity, understanding connection, where you are relative not just to other people, but relative to the natural world around you. I wonder what's been, you know, you've talked about these moments of maybe these life-changing shifts for you, going to Harvard and studying under Elaine Scarry, picking up that book. Um, what has living the practice of reciprocity and living this pedagogy done for you? What kind of impact has this had on you? It sounds like you were kind of in a way almost always getting there. There were like all these little hints that this was going to be something that you would latch on to. Um, I wonder just how has it maybe affected your life since you moved to Sitka, and since you really focused and really committed yourself to this practice and to this school.
Yeah. Um, I mean, it's changed my life completely. It's been the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me, other than perhaps meeting my husband and
Mhm.
marrying him. Uh, I mean, just truly, truly, truly life-changing. In fact, so much so that I sort of feel like I can't really talk about the deepest parts of it. Like it's just not
Sure.
quite something that you can articulate in a forum like this because it's so much about like the doing and not talking about the doing. But maybe, but I'll answer it sort of obliquely. I'll answer it kind of in two ways. One is that I think for a lot of my life, I thought like the key, um, the thing that would sort of make life possible and make life livable was beauty. You know, and I just felt like for so long I was sort of pursuing beauty, you know, beautiful artworks and beautiful music and beautiful things, beautiful writing. And I love, like, beauty is amazing. Beauty is so important and life-saving. Um, but actually, in moments of despair and pain and difficulty, beauty is not enough. Beauty actually really will disappoint you. Like you can look at a gorgeous flower in a moment of true despair and it won't be there for you. And that sort of maybe that seems sound maybe this might sound naive, but that was kind of a shock for me to discover
Mhm.
that at a certain point in my life. And I realized that the thing you need in addition to beauty is love. I mean, you really need love, a kind of reciprocal mutual love between people, that deep, deep, deep love for others and a kind of openness to the love that people give you in a place of interdependence, in a form of interdependence. And that's the thing that can sustain you. That's the thing that can be life saving. And so understanding that like love and beauty have to go hand in hand, I think, is on the sort of most abstract level what I have come to learn up here. And a thought that just comes to my mind, a story that I do feel I want to share is a family that has been very involved in the life of Outer Coast. Had a terrible tragedy last year. They lost a grandson, a son, a grandson, a teenager. He died in a car crash here, and they reached out to me to ask if the school would help with the funeral. And so I asked my students if they would help with the funeral. They wanted the students to bring food and to learn a song to sing at the services and various other things. And I told the students, this is a very heavy thing. Like a boy younger than all of you has just died. Like no one has to attend this. Like you all need to make a decision for yourselves. But if you can, the family would really appreciate it. And most of my students came and helped and brought food and sang this song and were there and carried themselves with so much composure and respect. But also, like, the hall for that funeral was just absolutely filled with people. I mean, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people came out to support the family and brought food and brought words and speeches and I never grew up with something like that, with a community coming together in that way. And I think it's just unbelievable to see a community that functions that way. I mean, it's such a gift, it's such a privilege. And I feel so honored that the Sitka community, and particularly the Tlingit community of Sitka, has allowed those of us who are not Tlingit at our coast to see the way that they conduct themselves in these kinds of situations, because I just feel like that's a thing, just going back to these questions of mental health and so forth, like that's a thing that could really heal the whole world, and to see and to practice that kind of love for people as it plays out in times of hardship.
And what do you feel? You've talked before, just when we've been talking before this particular episode, about the importance of stories and orality to the curriculum of Outer Coast, to Indigenous cultures. Um, what role does that play in Sitka, in Outer Coast? And is that a big part of this creation of community and, like you say, the cultivation of love and reciprocity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, I mean, just an incredible lesson to learn from any oral culture is people take language so seriously. And you realize that despite the fact that that sort of mainstream culture is in this hyper verbal phase in which people are talking all the time and people are posting all the time and just there's so much content streaming past our eyes all the time, language has been hugely devalued. Like language has really been kind of debased. Like people just say whatever all the time. And something that you hear Tlingit people say a lot is public speaking is like carrying a big stick, and you have to be very careful because you never know who you might hit if you're not watching out with that
Mm.
stick that's sort of swinging around the room. And I think it's that sense that, like, when you are actually speaking and you're actually conscious of the fact that your language is being transmitted to someone else, usually someone you're really looking in the eye, like you suddenly come to understand the just immense power that comes with language and the kind of power that comes with language. The way the responsibilities and the way in which it can be used as a tool for healing as well as for harm. And so, yeah, it has felt really extraordinary to get a chance to practice orality in a community that one still takes it very seriously. So training my students up in public speaking and also just getting them to feel that knowledge and self-expression and language can really be bodily, can be felt phenomena. And I think that's something that's so precious about public speaking and about orality is that it allows you to understand that these things do genuinely come through and from your body and yourself in a way that sometimes writing can feel, especially to people who haven't sort of deeply committed themselves to it as a practice or a discipline, can feel alienating or sort of just literally disembodying, right? It just suddenly the words are no longer issuing from your mouth. They're on this page. And so when I first came to Outer Coast, like it started small when I first came to Outer Coast, when I was teaching, I started this exercise where every student had to give a retelling as a story of one of the readings each week. And they had to do it from memory and it had to be 5 minutes long. And it didn't matter if the reading was a narrative reading or was a theoretical reading or a philosophical reading. And it didn't have to be like a fancy story. It didn't have to be gimmicky or anything, but it just like they had to stand up and be like, okay, in Locke's second treatise of government, he starts here and then he goes here and he goes here and he goes here and I wasn't interested in like an interpretation or a presentation with a thesis. I was like just literally get the story deep enough in your head, get the text deep enough in your head that without notes you can tell it to us in your own words. And I could just see them come alive to the material and be so generous with the material in a way that sometimes writing an analytical essay, students have a feeling like I have to have this adversarial relationship to the material, or I've got to get my own point in somehow. And so, like, I could just see suddenly, like, it changed their whole relationship to tradition, to text, to history, to have it inside of them. Created a kind of respect because suddenly it was part of them. And so to do justice to this thing was also to do justice to yourself. And it sort of built from there. We have a pretty elaborate now public speaking and storytelling curriculum. And what we really try to do with that curriculum is sort of bridge the gap between all the things that we're teaching them in the curriculum about, for instance, Tlingit culture, but also about world cultures and science and so forth, and then their own backgrounds, right? So a really important move at Outer Coast, and I think something that really, really has to be emphasized is that like when we teach students about this place, about these different cultures, we're not saying like we're trying to turn you into something that you're not. We want you to see this and understand by analogy what it is in your own background, in your own life that resonates, that is similar, that you can have a similar relationship to. And we use public speaking and storytelling as a way to ask students to start thinking about those questions. You know, what does my relationship to the land look like? What is my relationship to tradition, to heritage, to kinship, to community in all of its complexity look like?
It seems like the community there in Sitka has been able to, well, in a way, of course, maintain because the community's been there for many, many, many generations since time immemorial. But also as it has evolved and the school has come out of that community, it seems like, from an outsider's perspective, that you've created this almost nice bubble where experience and the way students are experiencing education and really getting very involved in the community is not to say that this doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, but that that's not the common experience that most young people have today. And it seems very counter to what most of our general experiences are, which is increasingly in the society at large, we are much more isolated. There isn't a lot of time and space given to sitting with something, to listening with something, to grappling with something. It's much more information overload. Open up your social media feed, just be hit with constant information, not really having a lot of time to take it in, being so busy with so many things that we forget, about our neighbors across the street, or, we're just so busy and so wrapped up in our own world and so isolated in a lot of ways from other people. What are just some things people can do to start practicing that in everyday life?
Boy, that's a big
hmm
question.
I'm asking you to solve
Hi.
all of the world's problems right now, if
Right.
you didn't pick up on that.
Yeah. Well, and especially I really don't feel myself qualified to
Mhm.
opine on slowing down because that is not a great
Mhm.
description of my own life. However, I will say I do think that one problem is like there is too much uh people lead too much with language and not enough with doing. I was going to say action, but it doesn't, but action can sort of imply like big dramatic interventionist gestures, and I don't necessarily mean that. I think like my experience, and this is again, this is not maybe for the whole world, but certainly for people who have spent parts of their lives in universities. Like my experience in the last 2 decades in academia, in the university systems, like, and in the whole world that flows out of them, nonprofits and magazines and so forth, is that like people have become really, really invested in like talking about and putting a label to like various forms of good behavior or righteous behavior or proper behavior. And there's a kind of endless debating of them. And, you know, there's a particularly toxic version of sort of trying to critique them or be holier than thou about other people's definitions of the good, but even more innocuous ones, like there's just so much talking about it. And I think some level of considering it and questioning it and thinking about it on the level of discourse is important. But my sense is that, I mean, I guess the thing that feels so important to me up here, and I'm always reminded of when I go from here to say, like giving a talk at a big university on the East Coast, is like the difference is that the talking about things follows from the having done things and reflecting
Mm.
on them rather than vice versa. And so like, which again is why I think I brought up the example of something like my students helping out at a funeral. Like, it's so important. Like, the whole reason why you study literature and philosophy and art is to think about death. I mean, or one of the most important reasons. And we read stories and novels and poems and history books that are all about the nature of death. And you and I were talking about before we started this recording, we were talking about the Walter Benjamin essay on the storyteller, and he says death sanctions everything that the storyteller does. That's what he says. But like that's because death is an actual true part of life. And like understanding that, like if you're talking about death in the abstract without really having some sense of what it means, like you're putting the cart before the horse. And if you can think through those things so that you can really be there in a better way for a family that's going through death. And I mean, ultimately, so that you can come to terms with your own experience of death when it comes, you know, for in your family or in among your loved ones or whatever. Like that's the reason why we do these things. And I feel like sometimes we get lost in the discourse, and I think it's better to to feel like, well, we're going to do the doing and then we're going to figure out how to name the doing afterwards. And also if we make a mistake and we've done the doing a little bit wrong, then we'll talk about it, we'll fix it, we'll find a way to make amends. But rather than sort of being like talking so much about like how you should act properly or act in the right way or behave according to these or those moral principles in such a way that it sort of paralyzes you and prevents you from acting because you don't
Mm.
want to make a mistake or you're afraid what your positionality is going to look like in a particular situation. Like that just seems to me like really, really gets in the way of living that kind of interconnected life. And that if you lead by doing, and then you save the talking for figuring out what did you do right and what did you do wrong and how can you do better next time, like that seems to me the proper relationship between like the vita activa and the vita contemplativa.
I love what you just said because I think you're so right that we sometimes worry so much about doing something the right way that we sometimes don't ever get around to doing it, or we're afraid of doing it the wrong way. And life is about trial and error. And you can't really get anywhere without making mistakes.
Yeah, my I had a sort of very, 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 very important mentor up here. Part of my adopted family up here, a woman named Yeast Uch Tla, Colleen Bunn was her English name, and she also passed away last year, like the other elder who I was really, really close to. And she always said, "It's with mistakes or not at all." And
Mm.
and I think that, I mean, there's just like there is just all the wisdom in the world in that statement, and that's something people have, I think, forgotten.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation and being willing to talk about so many wide-ranging things with us today. So thank you so much. If people want to know a little bit more about Outer Coast, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, you can just check us out at our website at outercoast.org, and you'll see lots of writing about our curriculum and our approach and who our faculty and staff are.
Well, Matthew Spellberg, thank you so much for joining us today on Good History.
Kallie, thank you so much for having me. What a delight to be